Hello, and welcome to POMA Does, a podcast produced by the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association. We provide a voice for osteopathic medicine and share insights on issues important to osteopathic physicians, residents, and students, as well as those who embrace the osteopathic philosophy. POMA's mission is to promote the distinctive philosophy and practice of osteopathic medicine for our patients, our members, and the communities we serve. Thanks for tuning in.
Hello, and welcome to the POMA Does podcast series produced by the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association, where we talk about all things osteopathic medicine, whether that's training or where you're at in the process, or specific things about POMA itself. My name is Vartan. I'm a fourth-year osteopathic medical student at Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine at Seton Hill, because there are many branches to our school. On today's episode, we're going to talk about expectations about what it's like for someone in their medical training career. We're going to talk about the beginning, in school, after school, and beyond. Basically talking about each pivotal moment in school, residency, and as an attending physician. So we'll hear from students and physicians who are looking back on that newly completed chapter, sort of to get some insight on what it was like, what you should look for and what to expect, and how to bend but not break under pressure. The structure of this episode will sort of be like a book, and I'll be your guide for each chapter. The only chapter we're going to skip is the pre-medical phase, because that could be its own episode, and we can be here all day talking about that and sort of the changes that happen every year. So we're just going to assume that you've gotten into school already and you want to know, what can I expect? Or you're a resident, you can say, what can I expect? So the first portion of this episode is dedicated to what's called the preclinical stage of medical school. Now, this is the stage where students are in the classroom. We're learning basic sciences, we're learning pathology of disease, we're learning how to take a history and physical, and in our unique case as osteopathic students, we're learning how to do hands-on osteopathic manipulative medicine. So our first guest today is Daniela Garçon-Anjou. She is a third-year student, a fresh third year, just took her boards and just started clinical rotations. So I figured who better to talk about preclinical aspects than Daniela. So hi, Daniela.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why don't we start with something a little bit more fun? Why don't you tell us, what did you think was the most fun and most enjoyable part of being in a classroom and studying 12 hours a day?
So I'll start by saying that I'm also at the Seton Hill campus, and our style of learning is through PBL. So we go to some lectures at the beginning for anatomy. And to that first part, which is 8 to 5 in a classroom, I'll say that it is fun to hear from someone else the things that are going to be relevant, that you're finally past that step of, here, learn all this information because it's going to be important one day, to Dr. Kalesa's lectures where it's cases and you see, okay, I should know these things because patients like this will need it at some point and they'll rely on me to know that. So I think it starts shaping up a little bit better than when you're in pre-med and you're just learning stuff because it might be useful at some point during med school. So that was really nice about anatomy. And then in PBL, I think up to this point, we've all had a pretty structured education as far as we have to pick these classes and we have a time to go to school and do these things. So it was fun to be able to structure our own schedules and kind of get more independence on how we want to spend our time in learning. A lot of people do really well sitting in a lecture 8 to 5, but other times it's good to branch out and learn from videos, branch out and learn from questions and other things. So really having a chance to experiment with that, and obviously just the content. You're finally learning of what kind of diseases people get and what things are relevant, some things that you've never heard of before, other things that you thought you knew about it, but it's actually completely different. You had no idea what you were talking about before. So it's nice.
It starts to feel real is what I'm getting.
Yeah.
And maybe one day I'll be in medical school too. Oh, this is what this is.
Exactly.
I guess it is worth mentioning, like you said, a lot of campuses sort of run things a little differently where you're in the classroom all the time. You're mostly learning from lectures versus some PBL curriculum like Lecom, Seton Hill, Elmira, even one of the branches at Erie, you get this self-guided learning. And for what it's worth, there are people who learn very differently, and that can add stress if you're in a lecture and you feel like, I'm not really getting anything out of this. I need to go home and study versus having that time. So yeah, I agree with you there. I think having sort of your own schedule puts a little more pressure on you to be proactive and make sure that you're on top of it, but also the freedom to say, you know what, I don't need to study today, or today I really need to study.
Yeah, it can definitely go both ways. And it's easy to fall into the trap of, well, I still have X number of days before the exam, or so on some days that you're really tired and you think, no, I studied enough. Sometimes it's no, you haven't. You actually need to stay here for another couple hours and do more questions or read some more pages.
So as a new student, you're sort of, if you're a first year, you're going to come in, you're going to meet some people. I think we had a pretty broad range of people in our classes. We've had people who are second careers, people who just started, some people who did a linkage program and are like 20, right? Pretty broad range of people. Now, that comes with the challenge of being a first year student and really getting that, oh my God, I have to study for 12 hours a day idea and feeling, and then the stress of exams. So what do you think was your least favorite part of this process?
I think learning to balance it all. And I have yet to master that. And I don't know if you ever, I think you start getting used to the workload and try your best to do things. In my head, I just picture it as you're pushing cards or you're filling out buckets and you need to work on all of them at the same time. And to that end, I think being able to maintain that balance for such a long time was probably the most challenging thing. You have days where your exam is coming up and you have like 500 pages or more to read or lectures to go to if you're in a lecture pathway. But you also know that you haven't slept very well or you have to meal prep. And I don't have children, but some people in our class did. And we had someone who was breastfeeding at the beginning of school. And so there's all these other things. Life is not on pause. Some students in the first and now second year class, there's a 21-year-old student and she probably doesn't have all those responsibilities, but there's also parents. And so life goes on. There's no pauses in learning to balance. I need to call my mom or do my lawn or all these other things. So learning to do all of that was very difficult. And then just learning to work through all that material was even more difficult. Learning to gauge what's super important, learning to trust your memory and your abilities on what are things that I've read and they make sense, I understand them, I could talk to someone else about it, and thus I should stop reading or watching videos on it. And what are the things that I've never heard of or the things that I've heard in passing but should probably go read or watch some video on it just because I don't want to show up to the exam without knowing anything. And trusting that at some point during your first and second year, you get some amount of working knowledge where you can, I'm not saying guessing, but you start developing intuition for the material, for how you should approach questions, for what's the best way that you can get the most information from your reading or your OPP class or something like that. So just getting introduced to how everything works is difficult. And I would probably say that you're constantly working at it.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to master. And I don't know if anyone does master it. And at some point, you're just sort of surviving, saying, you know what, I just need to get to the next stage. I just need to move on to the next part. And I don't, unless you've been a student, I feel like this feeling might not. We've all been there. And at the points where you say, you know, what am I doing here? I should have just gone to business school. What do you do to keep yourself going?
Well, I'll start by saying that when you're starting out, or at least this is how I experienced it, and some of my friends experienced it as well. You've given your everything to just get in. To have a seat on that first day, you've given up a lot already. And you have this sense that, how could this possibly get any worse? Just because the first day of class, you're sitting there, you've probably moved, you've done a 4-year degree or maybe a master's degree, which is a lot of people in our class have a second degree. And you're just sitting there and it's like, I've overcome so many things. I definitely got this. Until you're told, well, this is how the new pace of things is going to be. And so you kind of, in reference to what I was saying earlier about balancing things, and I will just quickly tell you a story at the beginning in anatomy. We had back-to-back lectures and I didn't know anything. And I still had exams and little forum things that I had to complete for every week. And I just use my calendar just to space it out in time, because it's very easy to just make a list and you're like, I'm going to get through these 50 things today. No, you're not. You're going to get through about 5 of those things. And so I started using the calendar to be more realistic about how long things take, how many hours there in the day, and when I can get through this, and just quickly just exploded and started crying. And I hate this, and I'm leaving medicine, and this is terrible. Who told me to come here? And then you just quickly think, but I also have to finish this, so I should probably just stop crying and you're continuing. This happens over and over until you get better at saying, well, but then remember this case that we saw. One day I'll probably have someone like this, and it'd be useful to not cry right now and learn what I'm supposed to learn and be able to use this information. And I will say that I'm in my second week of clinical rotations, and up to this point, I've heard it many times, and if you're listening to this, you probably have at some point. where everyone just tells you, you have to learn this for your future patients. And that at times doesn't make much sense because you don't think that the one fact or the one thing you're covering in lecture will be relevant. And I think I just have to say that it is. Sometimes out in the wards, it's just about, do you remember this kind of presentation? Does this sound similar? Have you ever seen this before? And it comes down to that one random Tuesday when you were reading on blank disease. So really just definitely cry it out, go out for a walk, just breathe.
I agree with you. Sometimes when you're studying, at least now that I've been through clinicals a little bit longer, you're sort of studying and you say, when am I really going to see this stuff? And then say, oh my God, I've actually used Winter's formula to figure out what acid-base disorder is going on here. And it's sort of weird because my dad will tell me this when I say, oh, I can't wait to be done with exams. They'll say, no, every patient is going to be a test from now on. You're not done. Now is the real test. And I think he's right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I agree. Sometimes you just have to say, you know what, it sucks, but I worked too hard to be here. Before you're in medical school, all you can say is, oh, wow, the only thing I want is to be in medical school. And then you get here and you're like, the only thing I want is to not be in medical school.
Unfortunately.
Right.
Some mental fortitude and just really, probably the best advice I could give someone starting out is really think long and hard about those things of why you chose to be in medicine. And I don't know, write that down on a piece of paper, put it in front of your desk and just read that out loud to yourself. And if you can at all, try not to quit because I think it can be very rewarding. I think it's very difficult the first years or first several, maybe like the first decade, I don't know, in training. But it is very rewarding to see patients, just to have someone thank you. When I was recently translating for a family and I did nothing, I was just there to translate, but I felt very happy to hear someone tell me, thank you so much for helping me. And I think until you get to clinicals and feel that, it's just very special. So just keep at it.
I agree. I think having just something to remind yourself, like, remember how good that was, and just keep on to that the moments where you're down. The thought for this podcast is in line with what you're saying. Medical school and training is temporary, but eventually you have this lifestyle that you enjoy. And that's by the end of this episode. I hope to see that my guests become less and less neurotic and more, oh, this is great. I'm glad I did it. So that by the end of it, we're all on the same page. But I'll close this with one more question for you. And that'll be, like we said, sometimes you think, I just can't wait to move on to the next stage. Next thing, I'm tired of this one. What do you think you're going to take away from this, the preclinical aspect? What do you think you'll say, you know what, I do miss that?
I think there's probably two aspects to this. One is just having the time, and this might be slightly different for if you're in an lecture pathway, but just having this freedom to experiment with how do I learn best? How far can I push myself? When is it a good time to take a break? I think figuring that out, the earlier you can figure that out, the better you'll be down the line. And if you're listening to this and you're halfway through your preclinical years, don't panic because I don't think I have it figured out entirely and you will keep working on this. But you do eventually learn a little bit more and it's useful because it makes this journey more enjoyable, which you don't want to get to the end of it and say, I never really got to have fun or enjoy the things that I was learning. And so I think whatever I learned, which specifically is how to study and how to not to compare yourself with someone else and how relevant all these things are going to be. I don't know. I just found that really helpful. And then there's just funny things that you experience in class all the time. Yes, it's class. Yes, you have to work for an exam and it's very stressful and you're always panicking because quite frankly, sometimes you just are. But there's fun times too. We're in a small town in Greensburg and there's fun times out with friends. I will say that for some reason for a class H&P was kind of funny just because when you're very nervous trying to interview a patient, you just start saying some random stuff. So that you can still laugh at yourself. It's a fun time, but you have to work really hard at prioritizing and timing things out. So I think it's just good to look back on it and say, even though it was very hard, we still had time to laugh, to cry, to take pictures with people, and still have somewhat of a life outside of medicine.
Yeah, I hear you there. I think it's sort of when you're under the most stress, that's when things are funniest, and that's when things sometimes are the most fun. And I agree. Sometimes you say, you know what, we're going to study, we're going to sit down and get this done. And then after that, we can go do something fun. And then it's so much fun that it stays in your head. And I agree. I think some of the things that I miss most will be just people I met and people I got to meet and enjoy being with in such a stressful part of our lives. Hopefully, thank you again for joining us and giving us your insight. We appreciate your time. Hopefully the rest of the episode will give you some insight as you move on to the clinical aspect and so on.
Thank you for having me again.
So next up, we're going to talk about the clinical aspect of medical school. So this is when students are actually in the hospital. We're on wards, we're in the surgeries, we're in the outpatient clinics, you name it. This is the aspect where you sort of get your feet wet and actually apply what you've been learning in the preclinical phases that Daniela talked about. So today I have a fourth year Lecom Seton Hill, Damien Seifer. Damien's a good friend of mine, and he'll be chatting with us about the clinical aspects and sort of giving us some insight into that part of the training process. Welcome, Damien.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So why don't we start with something light again? Why don't you tell us what the most fun and what you enjoyed most in terms of the clinical training so far? Now that you've done 1 year and you're moving on to the fourth year, sort of having that experience already.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The transition from preclinical years to clinical years is really stark, because I think for a lot of us, I was a non-traditional student, but for those who are traditional, we're in the classroom for years and years and years, and all of a sudden we get to apply it. And I think that was my favorite part of it, was that all of these factoids and Anki cards and random questions that I was, deliberating over for years, now it's a real person. It can be dicey too, because patients don't look like the textbooks. They don't look like the year-old questions, but you really get to engage that humanistic part that I think we don't really get to nurture a lot the first couple of years. We do a lot of scenarios, and some of us were in COVID and some of us didn't get to have too many patient interaction or those standardized patient situations. So I think we lost a lot of that, and getting to see patients and getting to be part of the decision-making process and getting to feel like I'm part of the team being helpful. That was the most fruitful piece of it. I was very lucky to rotate a number of places where I was treated like I was an intern, the intern to the intern. And so get my own patient panel and largely would be left to my own devices to try to figure out what's going on. And I get some gentle corrections and guidance along the way. And I think that's just exemplifies what medical education is about, is taking all the information and coming to a solution together as a team that really is going to benefit a human being. And the people are the thing that we don't get to see a lot of in the first couple of years of medical school. So getting to make some decisions, a lot of them are wrong, but getting to make some decisions and have some input that might actually impact somebody's life, it can't beat it. It's the coolest thing in the world.
I hear you there. And it definitely is a switch going from just seeing text and then actually seeing a person that may have, this might be pancreatitis. This might be something I've actually read about. And then you have to say, wait a minute, what am I going to do? And then you get into the more technical aspects that you get into a training with, like, how urgent is this? Do I need to do this right now? What am I going to tell my attending? When am I going to write my note? So I found that to be the real life aspect to be very different. Someone comes in with something and you're like, well, is this actually what I think it is? Am I about to label this person? And of course, we're not making that final decision just yet, but sort of getting into that process and starting to feel the responsibility a little bit, I feel like has been both rewarding and challenging at the same time, at least for me. So I hear what you're saying. Okay. So I asked Daniela this, and I'm going to ask you again, because this podcast is a little bit about setting expectations and managing them for each step of the way. So what is your least favorite part of clinicals, either last year or at this point?
It's going to be a tricky answer to a tricky question, right? I think the most difficult thing for me, and the thing I like the least about it, is that I liked everything, like every rotation I was on. And we have a year to figure out what you want to do. And then fourth year, you don't get to decide. I mean, we have all the rotations, but the first couple months of fourth year are getting letters of recommendation and doing auditions and applying to residency. There's no figuring it out at this point. You got to take step 2, and now you got to make a decision. And that's tough, especially for someone like me who had a lot of clinical experience before. I thought I had some ideas. You and I spoke about this last couple of years. It was ortho, radiology, general surgery, trauma, and ICU, just everything. Every new rotation brought me being able to envision myself doing that job. And I truly loved every single one of them. And so I think my least favorite part is that you get such a small amount of exposure and you got to just decide what you're going to do the rest of your life. And that's a lot. And I think you see a lot of unhappy physicians in your clinical travels, a lot of people who are burnt out and jaded. And you got to wonder if part of that is them getting locked into a career that they didn't have a realistic expectation of, because we're insulated as students. We get to do all the fun stuff without all the billing and paperwork and incredibly long hours. So it's not a realistic outlook on what medicine is always going to be. And so it's not a perfect answer. I mean, I didn't dislike any. That's the problem. I truly liked every rotation. There's a couple of specialties that maybe I would prefer to not do the rest of my life, but push comes to shove, I'd much rather do psychiatry than I would roofing in the middle of the summer in Miami. I've spent summers helping demolish flooded houses when my uncle was a subcontractor in Florida in 95-degree weather. And I'll tell you what, I would do any specialty in medicine before I did something as difficult as that. So I think we're blessed in that way.
I agree. I think that's something that is sometimes lost along the way, where you sort of get into this point where you expect everything to be perfect and everything to be exactly the way you want it to be. And so medicine sort of attracts that type A personalities a little bit. But I agree, at the same time, you're still taking care of people. You're still comfortable. You're not doing any heavy lifting generally. You're sitting in an office or a hospital. Yes, it's stressful, but it's a different lifestyle. And I agree. It can be hard to pick something because sometimes you can say, I'd be happy doing that. I'd be happy doing that. So what's the best fit? I agree. It's sort of been for me as well. And I call myself undifferentiated. So we'll see where it goes. Now, on the days that you do say, I've seen a lot of disgruntled attendings, the residents don't look happy, maybe I should just drop out and go to business school, or maybe I should have been a lawyer. What do you tell yourself to keep going?
For me, I'm going to have probably an non-traditional to this, because I was a nurse for over a decade before getting into this. And I knew with deep conviction that medicine was what I wanted to do. Before nursing school, I was in pre-med, and then I switched to nursing. And throughout that over a decade of patient care experience, I really just learned to love the job, helping people, at least from what I could see from it from that other side. So I knew all the things a lot of people get jaded about a hospital, about the corporate aspect of it, about the lack of care for patients, about difficult patients or sad patient outcomes. Those are all things I experienced. And so I think that I didn't come into this jaded. I came into this with a fairly realistic idea of what to expect. And when I'm struggling, I try to just remember that I'm blessed to be here. First, the only man in my family to graduate high school, one of few family members who've gone to college, first one to go to a doctorate program. Just the way I was raised, the culture we came from, that wasn't super realistic. And so the fact that I'm even here is a blessing for me. I just try to think back to that, a little cheesy for a minute, but to that kid that was like 10 years old who cracked open it. My grandmother had this 1977 Encyclopedia Britannica set. I remember opening it up and learning all about what was inside the body. I didn't know what the bones were. I didn't know what our organs looked like. To see all that, even black and white in that old Britannica, I just remember being totally fascinated by it. Thinking, this is cool. I want to know more about this. And now that we're here and we're coming to a point where we get to use that information for the good of other people, I think that it's not too difficult to kind of stay connected. I just try to remember like that awe and wonder that I had about care that we can give and the science behind healthcare and behind medicine. I try to stay connected to that. And if that doesn't work, I go on and I look at job boards and check out salaries and specialties I'm interested in. I'll be
not a bad way to keep yourself going in the short term sometimes. I do appreciate the personal stories that you've sort of added to your answer, because everyone's motivation is a little bit different. And sometimes that's not as apparent, and it can be very helpful to have that perspective. Someone who's maybe done the thing that you're saying, maybe I should have just done whatever X job. And for that person to come in and say, I did it and I'm still here, sort of makes you think, okay, maybe there's a reason I'm here. Maybe there's a reason I should keep going. I appreciate the input. You have a different experience, sort of a unique experience for that. Whenever you put in an order, you know what it entails on the other side. So you might be a little more hesitant put in Q2 blood draws because, you know, as the poor person who's going to get poked and the person has to wake them up at 2 a.m. is not going to be happy about it.
Yeah, I still have worked periodically as a nurse throughout medical school. It's given me a different perspective. Those orders that used to make me grumble, now I have an understanding and appreciation for why we do it. It's not about getting through my 12-hour shift. It's about how do I take care of this person. Sometimes the best thing's not the most convenient, but so I have a great respect for the work nurses do, but I think I have a much greater understanding for why we make the decisions we make in medicine.
Very true. Very true. Something that I wouldn't know, not having been a nurse myself. Now, as we wrap this section, this is what I ask for each of my guests and what I will ask the next couple that come on as well. But, you know, as we move on, sometimes we say, you know, oh, I wish I was just in residency so that at least I'd be getting paid for what I'm doing now. Or if you're in preclinicals, I just want to be in a hospital. So sometimes we look to the next step. What do you feel like you'll take away from this step that you're in now? What can you look back and say, you know what, I missed that?
I think you alluded to it earlier. We don't make those final decisions right now. We're in this safety bubble of getting to just learn with pure wonder about all of these different specialties in medicine and all the different treatments and all the different. And one day we're going to be the final answer. We're going to be the one who's got to sign that order, sign that decision. We got to live with those outcomes for better or worse. And I think I try to stay connected to that and really just appreciate just the pure learning, the pure joy of this period of time, because there will come a time where those stakes are so much higher. I have no idea what that's going to feel like, but I can imagine. And I've heard attendings over and over again. It all changes when you're an attending. It's like residency is this bubble and then boom, it's all on you. And I think that part of that's scary. part of that's also gives me so much hope for what we're going through, because you see these attendings and you look at them, they're like godlike figures that they can do this and they can create this kind of change and heal these people. And sometimes I wonder, am I going to ever get there? Am I ever going to make it there? But when I take a minute to look back at how far I've come just in these few years, and this last year of clinical experience, we'll get there. We're all going to get there. And that's going to be a beautiful thing when we do, but the journey is part of the fun, as cliche as it is. And so I'm just trying to enjoy this time, try to enjoy this piece of the journey, and getting to make the connections I'm making with people like you, Vartan, and so many others in our class. I think it's going to be real eventually.
Yeah, I agree. Even now, I'm hesitant whenever I sign something as a student note, even though it gets attested. When I'm doing the physical, I say, was it a regular breath? I have to doubt myself. Like, do I really want to say that? It's tough. I agree. Sometimes when we get a call, someone's frantically saying, this is going on. What should we do? And sometimes I think, oh my goodness, like we should get a doctor in here. And then I think, oh, wait a minute, that's going to be me soon. And I'm so impressed by the attendings who would just calmly say, oh, this. And I agree. What? I'm sure one day we'll get there. But in the now, it's nice to know that, okay, I'm still learning. And so it's all right to not know everything just yet. But thank you for coming on, and thank you for your time and input. I think everyone can sort of take away something from what you've said. And again, this will be the second step. So as we progress, we'll see what it's like as a resident. And then attendings will confirm our story or deny our story. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Vartan. Take care, guys.
All right. Moving on to the next step, residency. This is the point where you're already a doctor, but you're still in training. You still have a lot to learn. And for some people, at least it's recognized as one of the toughest parts of training because of just the sheer amount of time that you spend and number of patients you see, and all the while still learning. Today, I have with me Dr. Zach Shai. He is an internal medicine resident at the Community Osteopathic program in Harrisburg. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Vartan. I appreciate it.
Of course. So I'll start this off the way I've started with all the other guests. We'll start with something a little bit lighter, and then we'll get into more of sort of what to expect and how to get through the tougher times for each stage. Notably, residency, it has the infamous understanding that it's going to be rough regardless. So what do you find the most fun? Well, what do you enjoy the most about it?
I think easily the best part about residency, and something that I'm dreading when I leave residency, is having a good conglomerate of people who are within the same scope of practice as you, in the same level of training as you, and that are people that you can kind of bounce things off of. One of the more difficult parts that I'm seeing with attendings is that you no longer have that support system of all those people around you. And so it's a pretty big deal for me when you walk into a resident lounge and you have a whole bunch of people who are around the same age as you, at the same level of training as you, that you can kind of bounce ideas off of. And you can it just makes training all the more better when you have someone to struggle there with you. So I would say that.
It definitely, camaraderie, I've found, has been one of the best parts of just this training process. Is such a high stress environment, and it definitely helps to have people to vent to and sort of work with. And like you said, the responsibility is something as a student it slowly starts to hit you because you get a little bit more each time. But I know, at least at this point, someone actually knows what they're doing, so I'm not as concerned. But I imagine in residency, you're that someone, so you better know.
No, you still have a safety net too. That's also another excellent part. And I've talked to other people about this because you've told me the question. So I was asking around, and a lot of people like the fact that they have that safety net as well, because it really makes training all the more easy when you know that you have an attending that's there who's going to be kind of looking over your shoulder. You can put in orders independently and you're an independent physician, but at the end of the day, you have someone who's kind of watching over you. So that's helpful too.
Right on. Yeah. So, I mean, along that, we talked about some of the good things, but a lot of this, the theme of this podcast is sort of what should someone expect? Like a new resident might watch this and say, okay, what do I really need to watch out for? What should I be worried about? So in that sense, what's your least favorite part of residency?
I mean, my least favorite part was the beginning. It's kind of like a shell shock when you first get in, because you're thrown into the deep end. You're not alone by any means, but everything's new to you. You have a whole new EMR that you're working with. You're working with a whole group of people that you've never met before, a whole bunch of residents that you don't know all that well, besides interviews and what you've done on your audition rotations. But for the most part, everything's brand new. And if you're not someone that can kind of acclimate to that environment fast, that can be really overwhelming at first. But you'll notice in like the first few months, everything gets easier. But for me, like at the first medicine month, or some of your harder rotations that you go into tend to be the most difficult when you're first getting acclimated to it, easily for me.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of it is just keeping information together. Just as an intern, at least, it's just knowing everything about the patient, knowing how to reach this. Oh, did you follow up on this? It just sounds like you said it. I've heard that word before, shell shock.
Yeah.
Just kind of thrown into it.
Yeah. And you don't have a time or space to think in the beginning. So it's hard to kind of look back on your training because everything's new, everything's scary. So it's hard to think. So your job is, when you're just starting out, is just to get as much information as you can and just keep your head above water, and then just know that you have a good support system around you, and then you're going to be fine.
Yeah. And I think you make a point about that. It's just important to at least have the understanding or to know that you have people around you that can help you, that you're not alone.
Yeah.
It's so busy. But on the days that you say, you know what, this is too much, I should have gone to law school, or I should have been a business major, what do you tell yourself to keep going?
I mean, for me, you have to really know that you wanted to get into medicine to begin with. The trope that everyone always says is that if you're doing this only for the money, you're going to have a bad time and you're going to know that medicine's not right for you right away. So for me, you're kind of always looking in places to find meaning and an explanation as to why you're doing things. And those moments show up during times when you least expect it. A lot of times it's like, for me, for instance, it's when you're doing something new, or it's when you're on call and you feel overwhelmed, and then a patient or a nurse or someone reaches out to you and has like a moment where everything becomes a little bit more meaningful, and it kind of brings you back to why you did it in the first place. And then if you look back at that particular moment during times that are particularly hard, I find that to be the reason why I'm not in law school right now.
I have heard from the students before we record this, and that'll be seen in the episode leading up to this point, but sort of reminding yourself why you were here. I agree, especially in medical school too. It's like, remember how you felt, how much you wanted to be here, and nothing else mattered but to be in medical school. And then you actually get there. Oh my God, is this what I wanted?
Yeah. And if you could like take a moment out of your day to do something that's like really nice and kind of just reinvigorates your purpose, it really helps. Like if there's someone who is really sick on the floor and he or she is really scared, and you can go up there and you can spend an hour with them, or you could have ice cream with them, or you could do something that, like, going out of your way while you're ridiculously busy, if you could just take those 5-10 minutes, that is as good for the patient as it is for my own mental sanity.
And I found that to be sort of, this is more of a personal side without sharing too much. We had a patient that you and I spent a little extra time with, and you would turn to me at the end and say, sometimes people need to feel like they're being listened to and they appreciate the time that you put in like this. And that sort of stuck with me a little bit as well. So I hear what you're saying. What will you miss the most about residency? Sort of wrapping up this section, what would you feel like, although you'll say, oh, it's so busy, but when you look back and say, you know what, I missed that. Well,
I'm really going to miss the people who are around me. I'm going to miss being in an environment where I can have people where I'm learning from different specialties all the time. In medical training, once you become an attending, the training never stops. You're always practicing, but you're a little bit more independent. Whereas in residency, you always have people around you that you're constantly learning from. And so I love medical education. That's something that I pride myself on, is being super involved in medical education. So I'm really going to miss the education standpoint of things probably the most. And that's what I'm probably going to try to get involved with as much as possible. And that's why you see attendings where once they leave, there's so many of them who come back to our residency. I'm sure you've worked with our teaching attendings. So many of them are the attendings who have come through our program itself, and they just love to give back because they just love that environment. They love the teaching environment. They love the community around it. And so that's what I'm going to miss the most easily.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for your time. I do agree. It sounds like a theme here is community and the people around you making the experience what it is. So stay tuned and we'll see what it's like to be an attending.
Sounds good, Vartan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now that we've heard from all the students and the resident, it's time to get to the last stage of the training process. And at this point, I guess you're still learning, but it's not so much a training anymore. Today, I have with me Dr. Medali. She works at LVH School, and she practices family medicine, OB, does training with the residents, has a couple clinics, works at the hospital. Very involved from what I understand. So thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Medali.
You're welcome. It's exciting to be here.
So we'll just get right into it. The questions I ask you will be a little bit different just because the training is over, but still sort of on the same vein of what expectations to have. So I'll start with what I've asked everyone and sort of on a lighter note, but what's the most fun thing, or what do you most enjoy about what you do now that you're an attending and it's a little bit different?
Now that I am out of training, the most fun for me is to put all the pieces together. Family medicine is such a broad category, and throughout training, you get the patients that come through. You have to do a little bit of everything. And now that I'm several years out of training, I'm able to kind of create the patient panel that I like the most. So since I do family medicine and obstetrics and pediatrics, my panel looks very different. It's much more women under 40 plus their children, whether those are children that I delivered or women I took care of prenatally, and then kind of supplemented with family members of those families that I started with as prenatal patients. So while I continue to see any patient that walks through the door, the best part is getting the chance to be a part of these patients' lives and have them stick with me forever.
Sometimes in training, you feel like, why am I learning this? Or I'll never use this, or things like that, that obviously are not true, but that's what it might feel like at the time. It's interesting to hear that at the end of the line, you can say, you know what? This is what I like. I want to see more of this. It sounds like that's sort of what you built for yourself. So it's interesting. And it sounds like the panel you have is quite unique. It's like you said, you'll see anyone, but family medicine is just so broad that it really can be whatever you make it. What do you feel like is your least favorite part, however?
So my kind of all along the same theme is that there are definitely disease states and types of patients that I dread seeing. I think that's true for anyone in family medicine, primary care clinic, is that there's usually that kind of person that walks through the door and you're the one working that day. And they've got, in my case, 18 heart complaints, can't breathe, and are on a million medications and are grumpy, and I'm not their primary doctor, maybe. So those are the ones that I'm just like, oh, I'm glad I only have to see you for your sick visit today, because I know that I have colleagues that are so much better at taking care of you in my office that I can punch you over to them, but still provide great care. But in doing so, I can say, okay, you belong more with this other person who has that niche.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've sort of experienced that just so far in my training as a student. Whenever I write discharge summaries and things, I'll say, follow it to primary care. And it just seems like everyone will say, yeah, let's just put it on this person. They'll figure it out. So then sometimes you have 15 minutes and you're expecting it to be like, oh, this will just be a follow-up. And then I've been on rotations where I've told the attending, well, they say how they're doing. And I go, that's how many things we need to address. And they'll say, oh my goodness. Sort of what we talked about as far as the students is when we're trainees and we're still learning, when someone comes in with these complaints and we don't always know what to do, there is the safety net where you say, okay, I don't know, but the real physician knows what they're doing. So how do you feel now that you're at the end of training? Do you feel that, okay, yeah, I'm at that point. I remember feeling that way and now I feel better? Or is there sometimes still this feeling of, oh, I'm still learning?
I think you're always learning. Definitely remember having that great safety net. You go and talk to your preceptor and they just say the thing that magically makes it all come together. And really, on my end, I'm spending time while you're seeing the patient, delving through the chart, looking for that thing that's going to put it together. Maybe I just happen upon the right answer or got told by someone else something about the patient and can provide that, and hope that my students come to me with that information, but have it if not. The only difference now is I think my safety net's even bigger, because when I have trouble with a patient, I have other attendings in an office with me. I have specialists who I have built trust and communication with. And then I have the students and the residents themselves who are years closer to having gone through education and have learned newer things and newer techniques and newer medications. And so one of the things I love about precepting students and residents is hearing what the newest thing is. So I was just on my cardiology rotation and they said, this is what we're doing now. I'm like, great, this is good. I can take this back to my patients. So it really becomes a whole 360 safety net and not just those layers ahead of you in training.
I really hadn't considered that. I hadn't thought of, that's true. You become more of a team and you have other colleagues to rely on, versus as a student, you say, maybe I'll ask the resident if I'm doing the right thing before I ask the attending. But like you said, there's so many people There's someone for everything nowadays. If this part of your finger hurts, there's someone for that. So you could really get help from anywhere. It's interesting to hear you say that. The next question is a little bit different because now that you're at the end of it, but I'd ask people throughout training, the days where you don't get to choose your patients and you get to choose your hours and you just say, you know what, maybe I should have just gone to business school or been a lawyer. What do you tell those people now that you've seen the light? What sort of advice can you give them and what sort of expectation should they have at this point?
Yeah, we all have definitely been there. There are still days where I leave the office completely drained or do an 18-hour shift. And I'm like, why do I still spend the night taking care of patients? And maybe it is something else out there. But I feel like anyone who has chosen the path of medicine and invested this much time must be doing it for a reason. So sometimes you have to dig deep into how did I end up here in the first place? For most people, medicine isn't the default position. It's the thing that you've worked and strived and struggled for. And you can what I do a lot of times, if I get into a rut or a lot of my colleagues, you can always get more education. At the very end of residency, you're like, I'm never studying anything else in my entire life. I'm done. But as you get a little bit further out, there are new things I want to learn. So I wanted to learn more about LGBTQ plus care and transgender health because my patients were coming to me asking me questions I couldn't answer. And I love doing prenatal care and taking care of the newborns, but there's always something to learn. So those are the times I can pull back and go, okay, how do I make the thing that I know I love more interesting and less stressful each time? So definitely still learning. And if it's really got you down and you're really just done with medicine for the day, take a break. It's okay. Go home and watch that crazy television show or pick up a nonfiction book or sit outside in the sun for a couple of hours and it's okay. It'll come back most of the time. The next day, something new and exciting will happen that you go, oh yeah, okay, right. This is why.
It's refreshing to hear you say that. And I think I agree. So a lot of times just within friends and other people, I will say, why are you here? Medicine is not the easiest career option, nor is it the quickest, but usually people are driven by something, whether it's what they get out of talking to patients or a personal story or something. So it sounds like that perception is not misguided because that's sort of what you're corroborating as well. If you were to do it all again, and we'll end it here with this question, if you were to do it all again, would you do anything differently? And if so, what?
So I tell almost all the students that I'm talking to before they get into an end of college, looking at medical school to take their gap year. It's not something that I did. I wish I had because that first year of medicine is just so busy and you need that little mental health break before you start. Make sure that it's what you want. And then take time for yourself to do other activities through medical school. It is rigorous. It is 24/7. It is exhausting. But there are extracurricular activities too. There are clubs and the specialties you're interested in and people who would just want to be outside and intramural sports or get away for a couple of hours to a city if you're in the country or the country if you're in the city. It's okay to take those 10 minutes or one weekend every couple months. And then once you hit residency, that's the fun stuff. The hours are exhausting. The requirements are exhausting, but you get to talk to patients and see what it is you can find out about them. And sometimes if you're lucky in a rural residency like mine, you see the patient at lots of different offices and you really get to know them because you just keep showing up at their appointment again and again. So my best advice is to just take the time. Nothing is set in stone. Things take longer or less amount of time. And as long as you're hitting all of those end of the road milestones, it's okay to let yourself have some mental health time because we all need it. And find the thing that makes you the happiest. If it's travel. If it's reading, if it's getting together with friends, don't give that up and just find the way to do the work around that.
I couldn't agree more. I thank you for that feedback and those thoughts because a lot of people will, hopefully when they hear this, a lot of people are always thinking, what's the quickest way I can get through this? I just want to get to the other side. And we forget that we're people and that you can have some time to figure out what you like and what you don't like and what you like outside of medicine. And I don't know, at the end of the day, you have to find what makes you happy. So it's important to make sure you're doing that and not just running through training, just be working forever after that. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the insight. Hopefully everyone that's listening will have seen the progression from student to your smiling face now saying, keep going. This is what you can expect. And it's probably going to be worth it.
Great. Thank you for having me. I look forward to hearing the episode.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of POMA Does. Be sure to subscribe to POMA Does wherever you listen to your podcasts, and tell your friends and colleagues to tune in. Learn more about osteopathic medicine and POMA on our webpage, www.poma.org, and join the conversation on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, or email us at poma@poma.org. We'd love to hear from you. Join us next time for another edition of POMA Does.